The Perverse of Justice, a tale of Udemba's line. The soil of Ezinifite was the color of dried blood, a deep rusted laterite that clung to the feet like a persistent memory and fed the roots of great stubborn trees. In this land, justice was not a concept held in leather-bound books brought by the white man. It was a living, breathing entity woven into the very fabric of kinship, etched into the memory of the ancestors with invisible chisels, and enforced by the silent, watchful spirits of the land. It was a system that demanded balance, and when that balance was tipped by greed, cowardice, or a failure of memory, the correction was often as terrible and absolute as the crime. The people said that the earth remembered better than any living man. If a wrong was left to rot, it would turn that rot into a root and push its way back into the daylight. This is the story of such a tipping, of an injustice that festered within the kindred of Okpimodu like a worm in the heartwood, and of the dreadful, unequivocal answer that came from the earth itself, answer that would, in its resolution, birth a new and more terrifying mystery. The root of a story in Ezinifite is rarely a single act. It is a tangle of seed and humus, of intention and accident, of speech and silence. The tale begins with Okpimodu, the man whose name meant the womb of the community, and the three sons who grew like the braids of a rope around him. Awuja, the first, steadiness made flesh. Awuja, the bright second, who laughed like the crackling of a het, and Umunna, the third, whose eyes missed nothing and whose hands were forever calculating. From them sprang the wide and complicated wave of the Umunna. They were kin by blood and bound by law. They farmed the same floodplain, buried under the same Oji tree, and settled disputes over palm wine, as if the village's fate hung on the way a single vessel was poured and passed. The elders were the living memory of the laws, the young learned by watching, and in this weaving there were knots, secrets and jealousies that only the soil knew. Awuja died like lightning, fast, unbearably bright, then gone. The village said it was fever, an evil wind that had found his chest and borne too hot for human lungs. His widow, Ezinifite, who had once danced with a kind of careless pride, was left with 5 small bodies and the heavy, practical knowledge of how easily life withers without a man's palms to steady a roof beam. Her wails during burial were not only for the man who had loved her, they were laments for a future she was suddenly without. The Umunna gathered under the great Oji tree, smoke of tobacco and sticky palm oil under their noses. The talk there was of custom, of ikuchiwanye, of keeping the house and the line. Eyes turned to Udemba's compound, set like a manor on a modest hill, because custom is a map that points to the nearest available hand. Ilonu, the second son of Udemba, fair as a sprout and restless as new fire, was chosen to step into Awuja's. He came into the widow's courtyard with the pomp of ritual and the awkwardness of youth who had not yet learned to carry another man's grief. For a fledgling, wow, it worked. The children accepted him, perhaps because they had no other choice. Ezinifite accepted him because the custom demanded it. He was a bridge. He was also light timber, only ever meant to hold a small weight. Then lightning struck again. Ilonu fell from a palm and was gone. The village clocked twice by grief within a single turning of the. The rumor spread the way gossip does among women carrying water, quick and wait with fear. Thus there was never time to ask whether the fall was one of those things beyond measure or an accident quietly arranged. The villagers told themselves the truth they wanted. It was a haunting misfortune, they said. Ilonu had always been daring. Men shook their heads sadly and returned to the yam band. What the law required next was plain and immutable. The chief mourner, he who paid the price of proper burial, assumed not only the grace of the coffin, but the right to rendition of the man's movable assets, and when the smoke cleared, a lawful claim upon certain lands in limited circumstances. Ufoze, the youngest brother, the tempered flint, stepped forward. He sold his goats and pawned an ornament or two. He bought the finest cloth and the handsomest goat. He financed a feast that went on like a ritual exorcism for 3 days. He stood like a wall while the cries around him thinned into coals. The law was plain. By the cost of the funeral, the chief mourner earned rights. When Ezinifite came to him afterward, bruised by no one but life, she asked not for the land, but for the fruit. The cocoa pods, the oil of the palm, they were ripe in the trees Ilonu had tended. She pleaded like a woman with the small lock of unfairness on her side. Ufoeze, a man schooled in the lessons of rope and community, gave her what she asked. It was a simple permission, an act that would have been wise if only men remember such niceties forever. He bound a condition to his kindness like a bead on a string. The land remained his. The fruits were hers to collect for the household of the dead. For years, the earth took care of itself. Ezinifite's children grew in the rhythm of their mother's hands. They planted yams, married, worked. The permission became habit. Habit hardened into memory. The memory was revised by those who had need. Our land, Ezinifite's sons would say. The Umunna, so often only half watching, let them say it, because it was convenient and because it was easier to accept the sight of thriving huts than to remember the ledger of sacrifices and cowries that had once kept a man's pride intact. Udemba's funeral was a splendor that would have set a stranger's teeth on edge. There was dancing and drumming and the smell of many fires. The kindred came from the further farmsteads to pay their last respects. In the shuffling aftermath of the displays of loyalty, when the men who had sat with Udemba's bier returned to their smoke and calabashes, Ufoeze thought it time to reclaim what he had kept in memory. He wanted his brother's little plot returned, to be cleared for his own sons. There was a logic to the world that needed no ornament. Seeds beget seeds, so plant them where you will. He walked to Ezinifite's compound, the sun on his head, and spoke like a man who had never feared putting truth before decent men. But the truth does not always sound the loudest. Ezinifite, older, faced by the assertion of a right she no longer felt as foreign, became not the pleading widow she had been, but a matriarch transfigured by years of carving life out of soil. Her sons, thick with the certainty of work and having soaked themselves in the daily sweat of that land, rose as one. I have known this soil since Ilonu died, Nwabueze told Ufoeze, chest thrust. We have chased thieves from its borders. We have labored at night beneath the moon. We are the ones here. We are the ones who have held that land while you are reaping benefit elsewhere. Ufoeze presented receipts that seemed to him a simple mathematics. The funeral had cost him a sum equal to a plot of land. He had given the harvest only, and now the children had grown to manhood. This, to him, was a truth of the sort that immediate neighbors accepted without thought. He proposed the Umunna convene and pronounce on what was clear as the path of a river beneath the Oji tree. The elders listened and deliberated. What looked airtight to Ufoeze was, in their rough calculation, a problem with lives attached. The men from Otuona's line, the ones with daughters married into Awuja's family and debts owed at the market, spoke in the soft language of caution. Do you want us to create hunger where there was bread. We could create fields, thefts, more funerals. We cannot be the reason our grandsons cut each other's throats. They brokered a compromise, money to Ufoeze equal to what he had spent on Ilonu's funeral, and free possession of the plot to Ezine's sons. They called their ruling an act of mercy and a safeguarding of peace. To Ufoeze, it was a theft dressed as kindness. It was an extraordinary perversion of the chief monarch's right. He left under a sky that had lost its warmth. Reputation, like a seed, grows roots, and anger, once planted, will sprout in the form of decisiveness. Ufoeze walked to the shrine of Okpimodu with a speed that surprised even himself. There are courts whose sentences can be bargained, and elders who can be shamed with gifts. The shrine was not such a court. It belonged neither to men nor to compromise. It had a singular purpose: to restore balance. He performed the rite with a single collar knot, a smear of pills, a calabash of clean water. He spoke aloud, because words must be given to the wind to take their weight, and to make the land know that a wrong had been committed. He did not demand anything but truth. At first, nothing happened, because the Alusi do not speak like men who can be hurried. Then the world began to unravel in ways the Umunna could not have imagined. Nwabweze took to his bed and raved of a white man with a dripping cloak standing at his bedside. Hai's wife said he had spoken of cold hands reaching from beneath the veranda. He died 7 days after an unknown fever left his face the color of. Adana drowned in a stream she had drawn from her whole life, without phrase or mark on her body to explain the soft silence. A respected elder who had urged the compromise was found stone-dead in his obi, his chest marked by what villagers swore was a cold, wet handprint. The Alusi's graph was not simply to punish, it was to make an argument. It was an argument with thunder. The deaths fell like a pattern across the faces of those who had bargained away a right bought with sacrifice and honor. It was as if Okpimodu walked with a long finger and tapped the guilty in order from those most directly benefiting down to the men who had arranged it. It was method and logic without mercy. Fear, like water, finds the depth of old shame. The villagers came now, not with the swagger of authority, but bent and small, like old spoons. The penitent procession arrived at Ufoeze's compound as a supplication. They asked him to come to the shrine with them and accept their fuller confession and the sacrificial cleansing. He agreed because he had never been a man to take comfort in vengeance. He wanted restitution, and terrible though the land's law had been, it was better for the community if the sickness ended. At Okpimodu, the priest, an old man with pupils like pockmarks of a night sea, a voice that held an echo, took their words and translated them into ritual. They presented gifts and a white goat, and the blood poured into the thirsty earth. The priest intoned the words many of them had not heard since their youth, confessions of greed, of fear, of arrogance. Each name was peeled like an old fruit. When the rite was complete, the sickness fled like a tide. The village breathed. They told stories then of having seen shadows change direction and of gentle breezes that smelled of babies and new bark. Ufoeze had his land restored, and the kindred told themselves it was an act of reconciliation performed and done. The tale became the sort of story that grows light with age, a warning whose teeth were dulled by time. Decades are a sieve. They let small truths fall through while catching the larger lies. Years later, when the village had settled back into its rhythms, and the legend had become a stern bedtime tale. Chukwuemeka, the youngest of Awuja's sons, began to Ezinne, dead many winters before, visited him not in anger but in insistent gesture, pointing to the neutral ground beneath the apple tree that marked the boundary of Ilonu's field. He ignored the dream until it became a drumbeat in his body. One night, he dug where his mother had pointed and found a small oil-preserved raffia bag. Inside, a corroded silver bracelet, a rusted snuff box with an elephant etched on it, and a brittle sheet of paper with clumsy English writing. The paper written by the missionary teacher, who had once passed through like a cooling wind, was a confession not of the land dispute, but of the original wound that had started the whole rot. It was Ezinne's hand, or someone writing at her prompting, making a secret witness out of ink and fragile paper. It said, simply and terrible, Awuja had not died of fever. She had given him a powder meant to keep his attention on her alone. She had been foolish and young, and had listened to a man from Otona's house. The powder was poison. She had buried the truth like a seed, thinking it would rot, thinking the land and children would buffer it from consequence. She had not known that a poison is clever enough to remap far futures. Chukwuemeka and Okeke, now old and the only literate men nearby, read the paper under a small flame and felt the air steadiest with an abyss. The revelation was not merely a confession. It suggested something worse. That the men of Otona's line, who later had most vocally argued for what they called mercy, had reasons that were not as transparent as public kindness. Had they been protecting their own? Had the monkey-like shadow of greed and guilt stretched farther than anyone had suspected? Truths do not fall quiet because they are revealed. They upset the order of things like a wind that sweeps a thatch roof into pieces. The evidence produced old inclinations and fresh suspicion. A cluster of men from Otuona's family had been pushing behind the scenes for the kind of rulings that would either keep their grandsons fed or their crimes unspoken. They had, many now whispered, formed a secretive circle decades ago, a form of mutual protection that no elder could have sanctioned, a weaving of debts and promises designed to hide certain misdeeds in exchange for silence. The society had a name, none pronounced in broad daylight, Nur, the hollow circle, because it was, in effect, an absence within the kindred, a place where the law did not apply. The men had been traders, clerks, men whose hands sometimes touched the cash and whose tongues learned to speak in the new language the white government introduced when it came. They had access to accounts and a readiness to favor those who would not ask questions. When the confession piece was revealed, it called them out. They felt the air change. Their grandchildren were unsettled by hints and sideways glances. The older men had to make an ugly decision to confess and pay the bounty price for that courage, or to dig in and try to buy the story back into silence. One of them, the last living son of the man whose jealousy had poisoned Awuja, cracked. He had been weak for years, and when the paper was found, he could not bear the weight any longer. He admitted to hearing the whispered plans of his father, to a night when a small tin powder was handed to Ezinne like a bribe disguised as charm. We thought to make him jealous, the old man croaked. We thought of the white trader and his love for Awuja, and thought to use Ezinne for our purpose. No one ever thought of. The late discovery also touched other brittle threads. The missionary who had written Ezinne's notes had moved on to another town, and then to the stations the government had set up for schooling and small recording of land sales. He had been, in his gentler years, the only man who could write an account in English that could be preserved. He had done so out of pity and the shock of confession. He had not understood the explosive potential of. Years later, the same white man, Mr. Flanders, returned to district in the new role of registrar to the colonial court. He walked the same footpaths and read the old names with a practiced, cool hand. He had seen the shape of land disputes play into courts that did not understand the idiom of sacrifice. Where the Alusi punished in a language of blood and curse, the colonial court offered ink and a long memory. Mr. Flanders' ledger of land titles had become a dangerous instrument. He recognized Udemba's line when petitioners sought to have their possessions recorded in formal ownership. This was an unmeant twist. The modern system offered security by the measure of a signature, but it could subvert the living law, whose balance had its own demands. Udemba's grandchildren, Ufo's sons, went into the colonial office because they were practical. The memory of Okpimodu was respectable and scary, but it did not offer a deed signed in the narrow, indelible English that could be kept in an office safe from tree roots and curses. They registered the land, and when they felt they had finally produced a thing that no Alusi could take away. Land in ink, they believed, lasted, but records, like rivers, set new banks for old water. The act of registration was not simply pragmatic. To some villagers, having the land registered with the white man's ledger read like an act of betrayal. The deep logic of the soil, where truth was a ceremony more than a contract, was offended. The shrine of Okpimodu, in its patient way, noticed. The colonial court had offered one thing and taken another. It solved certain questions but made others impossible by translating a local relational law into a universal, detextualized contract. A man with land in ink need not attend the council in the same way as a man with a claim by ritual. He could be a stranger to the ways of the Oji tree and still have a certificate that said the earth belonged to him. To some young men, this was liberation. To others, it was a theft of things that belonged not to individuals, but to obligations and to the ancestors. When Ufoeze's sons took the land to Mr. Flanders and had it enter as theirs, they did so because they wanted to protect their father's legacy. They did not realize that their act would be read by many as a denial of the old god's jurisdiction, a tilting of human law against the Alusi. Flanders recorded the land gently enough, and when he handed the thin paper to the young man who came for it, he looked at the cracked characters in the boy's untrained hand and asked politely whether they had thought about settling disputes in the court if any arose. The young man, Udemba the younger, nodded, imagining his children secure, as if by lockdown. He did not yet understand that every system that promises certainty creates a new root of resentment the day it is chosen instead of a community's ritual. From the inside of the shrine, a perspective that had not been rendered in the earlier telling arrives now. The priest of Okpimodu, called Nnamdi in the English ledger, and Ade in the whispered names of his relatives, was not a cruel man. His job was to keep a balance between the living and the dead, to be mediator between the human and the otherworldly. He had watched the village change as white men and the new government came and went. He had seen money displace meat, ink displace palm oil signatures, and the new registers displace the small but fierce authority of the elders' flasks. He understood both the need for a right title and the danger of forgetting the oath one swore to the ancestor. When Ufreze arrived at the shrine with his kola nut and his clean water, the priest had expected only the usual, a man bent on correcting a human wrong. He did not expect then the speed and discriminating cruelty with which Okpimodu would choose. When the sickness fell like a net, Nnamdi read the signs with a priest's solitude. Okpimodu had found a place where law had been corrupted. It acted not with political shamble, but with an old terrible economy. It punished the wrongdoers, but also demanded purification. In the years after the cleansing, when the kindred returned to work and the sound of distant drums once more stitched the days together, Nnamdi kept watch. He noticed that when the land was recorded in ink by Udemba's grandchildren, something shifted in the shrine's light. The Alusi's patience had limits. When men started to seek the comfort of foreign law without first reconciling with the spirit, Okpimodu whispered a warning in the manner of crows, outing petty misdeeds, stirring coughs that would not leave. Nnamdi found himself counseling not only rituals, but also a new kind of confession. If you go to the white man's ledger, he would tell boys like Udemba, you must also come here to be recorded in the memory of the earth. So he formed an obscure influence, small loans here, a favor there, a fresh goat gifted to the right person before a festival. He didn't know he was creating a network that would later be called Muru. He thought he was buying peace. He thought such bargains were the only way to live in a world that remembered everything. The society, once formed in his mind and awkwardly formalized, functioned like a root that set deep. Its members moved in shadows and spoke in glances. They paid small men and imported little lies that had the power to become large. Among the most dangerous of men are those who have seen their misdeeds and did not repent. The son of the original Izongsu flung on his own conscience, buried than the land, and urged to protect. He had watched the Umunna's verdict twist the right away from the man who had sacrificed for his brother's burial. He had watched his family prosper by silence and the convenience of others. He had felt, in a manly small way, that this was a line lacking proper protection against the tide of truth. When the confession paper was discovered, these men stiffened like stalks in a frost. They had built a secure place for their shame and now found it unroofed. Their instinct was to repair the shelter. They found each other and asked, how far would the kindred go to dig out old ugly secrets? The elder who confessed had been their Trojan horse he broke, but his breaking revealed that the mold had been spreading. The colonial courts had ways of taking a simple human problem and rendering it into a form of abstract, black-letter law. They did not and could not understand the liturgy of the Oji or the smells of sacrificial smoke. Still, they had power. A petition, once filed in the magistrate's office, could order men to appear to answer, to be recorded. Some in the village believed this to be a final rescue, an impartial and dispassionate body. When the revelation of Ezine's confession rippled through the Umunna, a faction wanted to take the matter to the magistrate. They argued that a man who had conspired to poison another should be subject to the new law and not merely to ritual reprisal. The magistrate, an Englishman who wore his certainty like a hat, listened politely and placed a formal summons in the old clan's hands. He asked for witnesses. He asked for papers. The idea of a trial in a magistrate's court of murder, because a letter said murder had occurred, was intoxicating and fearful in equal measure. To some, it promised closure. To others, it promised the drying out of the living law, as if blood could be redefined in a courtroom as a civil trespass. The village found itself split, those who wanted the healing balm of confession and sacrifice, and those who sought the finality of a white man's gavel. Ufolze's family stood, with surprising politeness, at the center of the discussion. They had the land, and now they had ink and a claim in the magistrate's records. Some of them wanted to present Ezini's confession to the magistrate in order to punish the instigator in a way the shrine had not. Others feared that bringing the case into the magistrate court would rupture the delicate, still-standing truce with the Alusi. Nnamdi the priest warned, "If you seek only the magistrate, then you will have only a verdict. The land will be rid of a human guilty, perhaps, but not the spiritual rot. You will stand with justice to one law, and the spirits will keep their old ledger." The magistrate's hearing was a solemn thing. Men came from other towns to watch the spectacle that seemed to them an exotic enactment of some very old drama. Mr. Flanders, the former missionary turned registrar who had earlier read Ezini's note by candle, sat in the gallery with an uneasy face. The old man whose confession had shaken the village was too weak to attend. His words had been taken on oath, and his guilt circled like flies over fruit. The magistrate ruled with the cool logic of the crown. He could punish, but only those who fit the evidence. The old man died before sentence could be delivered, and the magistrate decreed, with the finality of ink, that no further prosecution could be held against a dead man. He levied a fine against the family, a small thing by the measure of ritual justice. The fines were to be paid in cowries and a small donation to the magistrate's chosen charity in the nearest township. For the colonial law, case closed. For the living spirits, the complaint had been acknowledged in a strange thin wake paper, not blood. The village returned home with 2 midnights inside their hearts. The magistrate's paper did not so did the Alusi. Okpimodu noted the attempt to use foreign ink to warehouse a harm it considered the land to punish. In the 2 weeks following the magistrate's ruling, small things went wrong in houses connected to those who had made the case. A goat died inexplicably. A child's leg twitched with nightmares. A patch of land refused to grow yams. Nnamdi went to the shrine with a clean mind and very old patience. He performed a ritual he had never needed to consider before, both confession to the Alusi and an offering to the spirits in the magistrate's office itself, where white men kept their ink and their statutes. "We cannot take the court's agriculture away," he intoned to his priests. "Betrayals, we cannot allow the court to be absolute. We must ask the spirits to accept what the paper has done and ask them not to punish the living for the limits of human institutions." The ritual was as much a plea to the gods as it was an appeal to the strings that bound men to one another. When secrets are buried, they have a way of being stumbled upon. The confession had been one such stumbling. But secrets have cousins. People who had once been given small favors by Muru, the hollow circle, felt the wind change direction. The society that had once seemed a convenience now looked like a conspiracy. Men who had once asked for things now feared the reach of what had been asked for them. A cousin out of love refused to give evidence at the magistrate. A bride's father who had been given a cow months before was asked to speak at the OG and could not without bringing family ruin. These small moral failures formed a wave that tightened into a snare. Ufoize's sons, being young men and practical in the age of ink, sought at the same time both paper security and spiritual favor. They met with Nnamdi and with Mr. Flanders because the modern and the old could not be ignored if one wanted to live in both worlds. They were creatures of urgency. Their fathers were dead, and land is not an ornament but a need. One of them Udemba, the younger, decided to mount a reconciliation. He proposed that they create a new boundary ritual between the two disputing lines, a sharing of certain produce for a decade, a yearly feast electing a joint guardian for the neutral boundary. It was a wise human thing. Nnamdi thought it necessary and lent his presence. The men of Otuona who had formed Nwuru agreed warily. They did not want another public confession. They wanted teeth fixed and gutters cleared. At the feast, as men shared palm oil and yam and thick soup, one of the younger members of Wuru, frightened tempted though he might have been by the idea of public goodwill, insisted secretly that their old bargains remain. He argued that absolute truth would consume them if the white lad with the ledger found the wrong place to ask. He would not be alone. There were always those who think a small lie will preserve family honor. In all the dark that had fallen on the village, another presence brooded, one that had been dismissed by many as a fancy, Ilonu's ghost. He did not move the way the other spirits did. He was not a raging thing but a quiet observer who kept to the edge of the village like smoke. He watched the men with the old, patient approval of one who had died suddenly and thereby learned that much of life was not to be trusted. He watched Ezine's sons who had renounced the land they had once claimed, saw their shame, and felt a curiosity that passed for sorrow. To the young and pragmatic, ghosts were a superstition relegated to the old women who tended big pots and children. But Ilonu moved in such a manner that he made small repairs with his unseen hands. When a baby coughed at night, he eased a fever. When a young man was tempted to strike a neighbor for words, said at the OG, Ilonu stood between him and a clear heart. He was not a judge, but a memory incarnate, and his interventions were the sort that save villages from themselves, though they never make a handsome story. Okpimodu, the altar in the hollow, had been satisfied for a while, but spirits, like men, sometimes have a memory that refuses to be dampened by the neatness of a magistrate's paper. The original poison, the murder of Awuja, had left a stain. The Alusis solution had punished those guilty of the second crime to correct a natural balance. But some spirits are not content with mere punishment. They ask for a sacrifice that binds the human heart to its confession. The request came not directly, but as a subtle constriction in life. Young yams grow thin. A well that had always given sweet water turned faint and thin for a season. The Alusi demanded more than the settlement that had been made. Nnamdi heard it in the shape of dreams. An apple tree that would not bear, an old collar of Awujas does not warm. The shrine whispered, "The rot of secrecy is a long thing. It wants a sacrifice to be remembered in the body of the community rather than the ledger of the magistrate." The price the Alusi asked was not a child, as some common whisperers had feared, but a voluntary renunciation that would carry weight. One of Ufoeze's sons would have to accept an oath of wandering, that he would go from compound to compound for 3 seasons, living and laboring without inheritance, serving as a penitent for the family's rights. It was a symbolic exile, meant to be a living book of remembrance, and it would mean a loss of standing for the Ufoeze family, but it would be moral, recognized by the land itself. Ufoze's family barked. The sons were men with children. Pride is a root that grows downward. Who would accept it? Who would leave property and status? The decision, once delayed, became a sickness in the house. Ufoeze himself, despite everything, declined out of love for his bloodline. It fell then to the younger generation to choose. While the troubles unraveled, another secret quietly came to light. Old whispers in the market had once claimed Ezine had not been barren before Awuja, that she had been a girl who had known and been known by a teacher who smelt of chalk. The teacher, Mr. Flanders, long ago, had written her notes, yes, but that had been out of pity. What no one expected was this. One of Ezine's sons, an elegant man with a jaw like a plantain stake, Chukwuemeka, was Nolly Awuja's blood. He bore a scar behind his ear that an ex-lover of Awuja's had mimicked in her youth. The charge was explosive only to those who wanted property lines to be precise within the new registrar's neat pages. When the accusation of mixed parentage was raised, it was a scalpel to the fragile reconciliation. The Umuru men hissed that the claim had been fabricated to model inheritance. Others suggested it was the reasonable product of years and the many small betrayals of the heart. The magistrate's court could not adjudicate such whispers. It could only test a lineage in a way that the old law found quaint, by oaths and by witnesses. A trial by ordeal was impossible. The cost would be too high. Chukwuemeka himself, worn thin by dreams and haunted by the paper he had dug up, surprised everyone by coming forward. He acknowledged what he sensed in his bones and said he did not care if his blood was the wrong sort. He insisted the land should be used for the needy, and he threatened to divide what belonged to the chiefs among those who had less. For a while, his mood was like a bell run to warn of storm. Then something remarkable happened. Ufoeze's second son, a man with hands used to the whip of a hoe and the slow care of a household, volunteered for the penance the shrine had requested. His name was Nnamdi. He had been named after the priest long ago. And Hoj, his decision was as startling as a thunderclap because he did not come from some religious yearn. He came because he had grown up watching the poor in the family and felt that something in the soil had been paid for with a life, and that, perhaps, a life could be paid to suit the spirit. He left with a small calabash and his father's old knife and walked away without ceremony. He walked in other people's fields and slept under huts without warmth. He carried out tasks in the market and learned the minor languages of towns beyond the river. He bore in his face a humiliation that was more fierce than shame because he had chosen it. The village found itself watching him as one watches a strange plant sprouting in a pathway. Nnamdi's wandering became a living ledger. When he returned after 3 seasons, he brought with him new stories and an old, quiet authority. The return was a ritual. Nnamdi lay in the shrine until Okpimodu's priest accepted him back into the community. Then he planted a tree on the boundary between the two lands and declared his small inheritance given to be used for a public granary. His act was the kind of thing that mends roofs. It is not noble in a way that can be written about in long lines, but it is the kind of repair men call useful, and that longevity remembers. The last shock was the revelation about Mr. Flanders, the man who had mediated Ezine's letter long ago. He had not simply written and left. He had kept a copy in a drawer and had later used the note to help Ezine flee to another village for a while. He bore guilt for having betrayed the intimacy of a secret for the sake of a paper. When those who had accused him of being a meddler at least used his name for blame, he did not deny the paper. Rather, he defended an older kindness. He claimed that his role had been to document and to keep the record in case the living ever sought the truth. In the end, Mr. Flanders confessed in the magistrate's court that while his ledger offered certainty, it had not replaced the living law. He spoke in a voice with the patience of a man who had seen many things slide into the sea and knew that some things, kindness, property, guilt, have their own tides. His words did not heal everything, but they did something less showy. They made the magistrate aware that his own institution could not provide full redress. A fine notice is not a reconciliation. With Nnamdi's return and the granary planted upon the border, the village adopted a pragmatic peace. Udemba's sons kept the deed in their pocket chest of paper and also visited Okpimodu and the Oji tree to offer a yearly kola and a small goat. They had learned slowly that both accounts must be kept if one wanted to sleep. Even with the surface mended, fissures ran deep. The Umunna's moral authority, already weakened by the bout with the magistrate and the moral secrets, was fractured. Some of Otuona's family still resented the punishments they had borne. Others mourned neighbors they had lost and could not say whereabouts for what things. Nnamdi's wanderer oath had not fixed everything, but it had been a sacrament, small, communal, and recognizably human. For many years, no more deaths of the kind that had terrorized the village occurred. The shrine's anger, if it had abated, did not completely sleep. A slight chill lived over Ilonu's old plot on certain nights. The rubber trees rustled in ways that indicated an intelligence, but one that had learned to be discreet. The memory of the original poison never entirely left the people who had been its beneficiaries. Their children, who grew up with the knowledge that their fortunes had been seeded in misdeed, were sometimes proud and sometimes silent, but they carried the dark story in the way some people carry a felonious inheritance. The plot did not rest. The earth remembers longer than any human ledger, and it has an patience with which even guilt must reckon. Many years later, when Ufueze had been buried under the red soil he had loved, and when his sons were grey at temple and sallow at the face, something else moved in the fields like a sleeper shifting under cover. Udemba the younger, now head of the compound and with children who had the ledger's security in their hands, received a strange visitor, a man who wore the neat, thin confession of someone who had worked at clerks' tables. He had the look of Mr. Flanders, but he was not. He called himself Chukwuma, and he introduced himself as a man who had been taught by Flanders and who had been an assistant in the colonial office, now turned government clerk under the new independent regime. He had in his bag the fragment of a ledger page, thin, brown at the edges, and not a list of names. It was an inventory of payments and receipts that suggested that the man who had poisoned Awuja had not been acting alone. That payment had gone to more than one pocket. The list reached back to men who were now elders and even to the decayed trust of Muru. It listed small payments to a keeper of silence. Chukwuma had stumbled upon it while cataloguing old files that had been stored and forgotten in the regional office a generation back. For some, the discovery was a reopening, a fresh salt on an old wound. For others, it was a vindication. Those who had been accused now found themselves again at the center of the village's gossip and attention. Ezine's sons, older now, had to choose reopen the wound for the sake of truth or keep the peace that had let most of them leave. The debate was heated. The village assembly met again under the OG, and men spoke in the voices of those who have nothing left to lose. Udemba the younger, who had kept the ledger in his father's name and had had it registered by the colonial office years ago, found himself torn between the authority of the paper and the force of the earth. The Chukwuma list brought more than names. It exposed patterns. It revealed that the Umuru had been getting funds from Voyager traders and even from an official's petty corruption. Slowly, like a slow putrefaction lavished by daylight, their web of favors unraveled. old debts were named aloud. Pawed goats were returned. The kindred, faced with layers of wrongs, had to be creative to survive. The Muru's younger members, who had become merchants and clerks themselves, found their networks drying up. Some fled to the towns. Some made formal public confessions and paid, and that act of payment, one by one, reassembled pieces of the social fabric that had been torn. It was not enough to restore the past. But the acts of returning honor through small public offerings had a potency that a magistrate's fine lacked. It had the measure of directness that a face-to-face apology always carries. By the time the grandchildren of the original bitter men had themselves become elders, the Umunna had acquired a new texture. Its sins had been mended with new threads, half ink, half ritual. The kindred learned to do both things at once, to file papers that would read in an office and to carry kola to the shrine. They made a practice of telling the story of Awuja of Ilonu, of Ufoize and Ezinifite in schoolrooms and around fires. They used it as a moral lesson that secrecy breeds a rot that no power can fully keep down, that the land remembers those who have trespassed, and they taught their children the price of being a chief mourner. Yet the earth kept some memories to itself. Sometimes the boundary tree would cry sap like tears. Sometimes a visitor would dream of a man in a dripping white cloth pointing at his chest. The shrine was placated enough to be generous in seasons, and crop yields returned, but the particular tenderness of the older time had gone, as good manners do. What remained was a more complicated piece, a piece made of bargains that leaned on both public acknowledgement and private humility. The tale could have rested there, in the satisfied sort of way that stories close. But the earth is a long-tongued creature and has a sense of the unfinished. The last surprise was not a bolt of retribution, but a moral reversal that struck like a cool dawn. Years after the Chukwuma ledger was revealed, one of the last of the Nworu's original group died. In his dying breath, he called for Udemba the younger to come, and the two men sat close enough to hear the breathing of each other's guilt. The old man, with shaking hands, handed over a small book. Inside was a paper fragment, the missing entry from the very night that had given Ezinifite the powder. It bore a name that shocked the village in the way silence reveals a long Izin river. The name of Udemba himself, Udemba the founder, the original pillars whose funeral had been the implication was grotesque and humbling. Udemba, the man whose name meant the womb of the community, who had been accorded the respect of a great patriarch, had, in secret years earlier, moved to safeguard his line in a way that had not been recorded. He had, for reasons that would never be fully clear now, been involved in a complicated battle that might have set in motion the chain that allowed Awuja's murder and the later subtle cover up. Perhaps it was the petty politics of big families, alliance with a man who wanted Ezinifite, or a defense against the white traders' favoritism. Perhaps it was the desire to keep the household strong. Whatever the motive, the revelation toppled a pillar. This final revelation forced the village to do something harder than either condemnation or mercy. They had to look at the nature of leadership. For decades, the elders had been sanctified men, and now one of their name lay under another's shadow. The kindred chose, after long nights of debate, not to hang the man on a gallows of shame, but to perform a long rite of contrition that was perhaps more ancient than any adjudication. They called in Nnamdi, the penitent, now an old man of quiet hunger. They mixed the rite of Okpimodu with a public ledger reading and had every living elder step forward to give an account of one act of omission. The ritual did not absolve, rather It insisted that leaders be visible for their faults. The final moral was curious in its fairness. Not only men who are poor in pocket, but men who are rich in name must answer. The years wore on. The new elders died. The shrine kept its usual counsel. The OG tree grew a new knot. Children learned the tale as if it were a weather lesson. The story of Udemba's line and the alusi that answered is told to wake a boy when he would be vain, to sober a girl when she contemplates false advantage. The granary built by Nnamdi, the penitent, stands as a practical monument to the admission that sin can be paid for with practical use. Yet every generation rediscovers the story in new tones. Men who were city-schooled come home with a paper and the thought that the land can be held by signature. Their thoughts are new. Ink can make a man's right last a while in an office, but the land keeps a patient ledger. The alusi waits longer than men think, and when they speak the language of retribution, it is not the language of tidy formalities. The land's anger or acknowledgement arrives in seasons, in the shape of plants and the sound of birds. And sometimes, in the late hour, those who pass by Ilonu's old plot claim they see a figure in white standing at the edge of the field, not pointing with a finger, but resting a hand on the bark of the boundary tree, as if to remind them that there are debts in the world that only the living can pay in the exact coin the dead demanded. Confession, service, and an honest reweaving of the net that holds a community together. In the end, Udemba's line learned a truth too harsh for many men to accept. True justice is not a blade that one can wield only when it is a long, patient thing, an economy of sacrifices and acknowledgements. It asks of the living not simply the neat settlement, but the courage to be seen. In Ezinifite, the earth remembers. It will keep a record far longer than any paper. And if men choose institutional ink over the slow practice of truth, they will find themselves one day meeting the alusi at the edge of the field, where the land speaks quietly but unforgivingly, and waits for the day when a hand will reach back without fear, and a story will be told that does not end with more silence. The Umunna of Okpimodu did what it thought best. It bargained away a right for peace. It tried to put a cure where a root should have been dug out. That bargain became a seed of rot, and the earth, like a patient judge, gave its own verdict in the only language it had left. But the story does not end at the moment of the earth's vengeance. It extends into the ways a community receives its own darkness and chooses slowly, clumsily, to repair. The tale is not a simple condemnation. It is a lesson layered in human complexities. That leaders fail, that secret breed societies of silence, that modern law can complement but cannot replace a community's rituals, and that the ultimate justice of the land has a memory longer than a ledger, and teeth more patient than a magistrate's gavel. Udemba's line was stern and moral in its way. The village learned to be both humble and pragmatic. The final moral whispered now to reckless boys and frightened girls is this: do not treat the living law as a convenience, and do not let small acts of shame calcify into generational rot, for the earth will tend to such things in its own manner, and its care is absolute.